It's my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Brian McGill. Brian is a UMaine professor with a joint appointment in the School of Biology and Ecology and the Mitchell Center. As you're going to find out, he leads an interdisciplinary project to inform climate adaptation planning in Maine and in Vermont. It's a 4-year project supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation, includes 8 faculty from the University of Maine, the University of Vermont, University of Maine, Augusta, as well as academic expertise that includes community psychology, economics, computer science, and ecology. So a great illustration of the power of interdisciplinary teamwork. Brian's also part of another project that's just getting underway, focused on wild Maine blueberries. That's led by Rachel Shatman. You may recall that she gave a talk just a few weeks ago. And in that work, he'll be involved in forecasting blueberry yields under climate change scenarios. Please join me in welcoming Brian McGill.
Thank you. So, I want to talk about climate change and adaptation in rural communities, which includes both the natural world and the human world. So, climate change this is one example of what's expected for climate change. That star is Orono, where we are today. And under one scenario, you can see this, effectively, obviously Orono is not physically moving, but the climate envelope we're moving into is becoming increasingly further south. So there's 2020, 2040, 2060, and by 2080, Orono is predicted to have a climate similar to New York City. Obviously not the heat island effect that New York City has, but if you've been to New York City in the winter, they can have a cold day here or there, but they don't typically have snow on the ground year round. It's really a substantially different climate. And this is actually under a moderate climate change scenario. This is not under a business as usual, humans don't get their act together and do nothing. This is actually under a scenario assuming humans do get their act together and do substantial changes to prevent climate change. There are some of the effects. Mean annual temperature is increasing by 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The winter is going to be even more extreme, about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Rainfall really is not changing much. It's a slight increase, but the big thing about rainfall is the seasonality is going to change. Seems to be getting pushed a little more into the shoulders and more summer drought. And that's obviously going to have effects on crops, which is a lot of what I'm going to talk about. If you look at some of the more extreme climate change scenarios, that lower emission scenario is similar to what I just showed you. Orono ends up in New York City. But if you look at a business as usual scenario, which is this kind of exponential increase in CO2 emissions, we're actually going to be in Virginia by 2100, even by 2080. That's a really extreme change in climate. And unfortunately, to date, humans are, we're on the business as usual scenario. We had a brief blip in 2017-18 and with COVID, but there's nothing that seems to have long-term sticking power to convince me or a lot of people that we have yet to deviate from that business as usual scenario. So think about the temperatures in DC, right? DC is where you see 3 snowflakes and the entire city shuts down. It's a pretty different scenario than what we're living with today. So the core thing I study is how this interacts with species ranges. I'm going to give you an example from the natural world. This is a hemlock. And this map on the left, it's an animated movie. I'm going to show it to you in a minute. But this is starting 21,000 years ago, which is the last glacial maximum. And this kind of light blue is the ice sheet. And gray is where hemlocks live, and green is where hemlocks are very abundant. So I just want you to watch this movie for a second. Oh, you know what? When we moved it to another computer, I lost the movie. But the key point here, not surprisingly, is the ice sheets retreat and there's shifts, but it's really a very complicated shifting. It's not this nice, simple, everything marches north. You see there's not abundant hemlocks in the East Coast. There's two different species, Western and Eastern hemlock. Eastern hemlock expands. But one of the take-home messages that I want you to take from that is just that range shifts are very complicated spatial temporal dynamics. You can show them as a movie. They're nice and simple visually as a movie, but actually thinking about dealing with that scientifically and computationally or data storage wise becomes a much more complicated story. Okay, so climate change is already happening here in Maine. You know, it's hard to attribute a single individual event or a single individual season to climate change, but conceptually the kinds of changes we're expecting from climate change. Blueberries, the 2020 drought caused a 50% reduction. That's half of the blueberry yield. We're expecting drought to become more common. This should become more frequent. There's management questions like, will we need to start irrigating blueberry fields? For those of you who don't know, Maine's very proud of our blueberries. They're what we consider a wild crop. We don't seed them, and we, for the most part, don't irrigate them. We do some tending to the soil, some burning, and obviously some harvesting, but it's not a high intensity crop right now. Spring rains are also causing a lot of problems. We're getting more spring rains, which is causing significant pollination problems. Pests are coming in, right? So one thing is the crops have to deal with climate change, but they're going to have a new rogues gallery of pests coming in. That includes insects as well as weeds. Just as an example, the spotted winged Drosophila, which is an invasive species from Asia and attacks most soft fruits, berries, basically, things like strawberry and blueberry and blackberry. It uniquely, it doesn't wait till the fruit starts to rot. It actually attacks it while it's healthy before it's harvested. So it's a big problem when it lands on crops. It just reached Maine in 2012. That was a dispersal story, right? It landed somewhere else and it took time to get here. But now the big question is, what's climate? It's still fairly limited in Maine. What's climate change going to do to that? Farmers have an ability to switch crops to respond to climate change. And as you'll see, we're already measuring that happening. In other words, you could switch from apples to peaches, hypothetically, depending on how much climate change we're going to have happening. And in the wild environment, we're starting to already see a retreat of the boreal forests and an advance of oaks and hickories, which are warm temperate trees, as well as an increase in maples. And then that has consequences for wildlife that lives there. Moose, black bear, these are iconic to, literally to the University of Maine. It's our mascot. These are critical to tourism. They're a big part of the cultural identity. Are they even going to live in Maine in 50 years? So these are some very simple projections using techniques that are around for 30, 40 years and are extremely widely used. There's probably literally thousands of papers using these techniques. I won't get into the details behind it, but there's a map of blueberry shift. So on the left is today, and on the right is, I believe, 2080, and green is where it's growing the best. So you can see it's not literally leaving the state of Maine, but there's a big shift in where it's going to grow well. It's going to move up into Quebec. Black bear.
Brian,
Yes.
use the mouse to point. People online can't see.
Use the mouse. Okay.
Yes, please. Thank you.
And so here's on the left is black bear. You can see the blue is where its growth is most abundant, right here in the heart of Maine. There's a reason why this is Black Bear University. And again, it's going to be switching up to Quebec. So that's climate change. The framing that we kind of brought to this grant and the question we brought is this notion of coupled natural human systems. They're also called socio-ecological systems or SCS systems. There's a lot of different framings, but just the idea that, as David said nicely at the beginning, humans and nature interact with each other. And it's important, right? There's feedbacks within natural systems, there's feedbacks within human systems, but there's also feedbacks from human to natural and natural to human, which is a very complicated system to study, but also a very interesting approach to study. So put that in, a lot of you probably don't care about grants, but occasionally I'm gonna, it influences how you do research. So I'm gonna put it into the grant framework too. So this is a particular program, EPSCoR, from the National Science Foundation. It goes to states that are the bottom 50 percentile of states getting grants, which includes the University of Maine, but Maine in general. And it was designed to increase research capacity. So it has some very specific goals over and above just, have a question, do some research. It was also specific to the theme, harnessing the data revolution, which is one of NSF's big 10 themes right now. It's NSF, so it had to involve novel scientific research. And it had to build capacity, in this case, across 2 states, so Maine and Vermont. And this grant also has workforce development capacity, so training, and also increasing research capacity goals. So it's a pretty high dimensional grant. It's not just like go do your research. There were lots of goals and requirements and objectives for this grant. So into this, as David mentioned, we came together with a grant. I see Bailey's here and Tim is here. They're both part of the grant as well. Tim was part of the original grant proposal. And so our grant is Barracuda, Biodiversity and Rural Response to Climate Change Adaptation Using Data Analysis. Somebody called this a postmodern acronym because that phrase doesn't exactly spell Barracuda, but if you mumble it, you can kind of get Barracuda out of it. We love our logo, which is Barracuda farming and using smart tools as they're out there in the fields farming, which we feel like captures the spirit of what we're looking at quite a bit. It's a 4-year grant. It's about $4 million spread across all the institutions. It has, we lost Champlain, unfortunately, for a good reason. Our colleague there started a startup company and she left the grant to go do her startup company. But so we're down to 7 faculty and 3 institutions at this point, UMaine, Augusta, and UVM. The grant kicked off in September 2020, which you think back, probably don't want to think back to those days, but COVID and lockdowns and teachers scrambling to teach classes online. It was a very difficult time to start a grant. And in particular, the stakeholder component is a very challenging time to start engaging stakeholders for the first time. Face-to-face meetings were impossible. We had plans to go to a bunch of conferences, big like Maine Climate and Agriculture Conference with a lot of farmers that were off the table. They were canceled. So, but this is the basic framing, right? So we're specifically focused on rural parts of Maine. There's all kinds of climate change questions with urban areas and with urban infrastructure and other things, but we specifically focused on rural areas. We also specifically did not focus on forestry. That was a little bit political because there's another grant, similar EPSCoR Tribe 2 that's doing forestry. Mostly we didn't think that would do well with NSF. So kind of rural areas, not including forestry, which basically boils down to agriculture and conservation tourism. So we have the same kind of framing that I mentioned, right? So rural feedbacks of the natural world or the crop world. I sometimes call it organisms that live outdoors, right? So we're not talking things that hoop houses, greenhouses, houseplants, obviously, those kinds of things, but anything that's outdoors, which may be a crop or it may be naturally planted like a tree or a bird. And these have their own feedbacks of ecology, right? In a certain sense, all of ecology is here, diseases, dispersal, disturbance. Rural communities, there's all kinds of social and economic dynamics about adaptation to climates that are purely social. And of course, there are these feedbacks. Rural communities have various policies, harvesting policies, land use policies that affect rural organisms, and rural organisms are a major source of income, the major source of income in rural communities. And then, of course, the external, the exogenous factor injecting on this is climate change. And yes, you could study the effect of climate change on humans and behavior. We're starting from the premise that climate change enters in the natural or outdoor world, and then we have this feedback loop. So another way to describe this grant, this is the same picture you saw about blueberries, although now the color map is the amount of change in growing. So red is a big decrease in growing. So we organized our project into 4 themes. Theme 1 is outdoor organisms, crops and nature, and how that's responding to climate change. Theme 2, then of course, that has impacts on people whose livelihoods derive from climate change. So rural communities. And theme 3 is, you may recall this had a harnessing the data revolution. So that we pitched spatial temporal data as a unique new challenge. There are climate people have been dealing with this for a long time, but ecologists are not so good at the whole space, time, changes across space and time at the same time. So spatial temporal data was theme 3. And then we pitched a theme 4, which was stakeholder engagement and science communication, tying all of these things together. So these 4 themes are obviously very interwoven. Just briefly talking about the interdisciplinarity that David mentioned. One of the things we did that has worked, I would say, fantastically well, is we have interleaved teams, right? So we have people that are part of multiple of these themes, right? Theme 1 is clearly ecological, theme 2 is social sciences, theme 3 is computer science, and theme 4 is kind of this overarching stakeholder engagement, science communication piece. And so all of these teams are interleaved, which has led to, you don't have to take my word for it. We just recently had an external evaluation, and they were very impressed at the degree of coordination across projects for not 2 researchers here and 2 researchers there. But this interleaving of teams has worked very well as a strategy. This is just a fun diagram of collaboration networks. So these nodes are members of the team, and a line is a previous collaboration. We had a few small previous collaborations. I had collaborated with Nick and Tim previously. Tim had collaborated with somebody at UVM previously. But interestingly, the 2 people at UVM, Meredith and Nick, had never collaborated with each other. And this is the collaboration network after 2 years. So you can see we really have kind of embraced this interdisciplinary approach. And so I'm going to cover the research themes out of order. 2 of them have largely survived as proposed in the original grant. Themes 2 and theme 3, largely, as obviously just mentioned, just through time. So I'm going to describe those first. And then I'm going to talk about theme 1 and theme 4, which have not even come close to surviving as originally envisioned. So I think it's interesting. So theme 2, locally, Tim and my postdoc, Stephanie Miller, are members, and folks at UVM. So a couple of big questions. The broad question, how do rural communities adapt to climate change? And there's some sub-questions. How does cultural adaptation to climate change occur? So this is a social dynamics, if you will, a social evolution process. And there's also an agricultural question of, do farmers change crops? And if they do, is it responding to climate change? And then there's a nice synthesis piece of putting those together about actually, okay, we have a model of how humans change and adapt to climate, and we have an empirical measurement of adaptation to climate, and put those together. And I should say, we're officially in year 3, but with COVID, we're really more like in year 1.5 or 2. So we're at the case where I'm going to be putting out preliminary results, but I'm not going to have a final answer on any of these. So modeling cultural adaptation. This is a published paper, multi-level selection kind of question. This could be applied to climate change. It could equally be applied to something like COVID and encouraging people to wear masks or get vaccinations. But where you have large, at the group level, the society level, you have institutions or investments that encourage a proactive behavior that's beneficial to the society. Mask wearing would be an example, but crop switching could be another example. But at the individual level, it's costly, right? If you're a farmer and you switch crops, you've lost your experience base and so forth. There are a lot of cool results. I'm going to refer you to talk to Tim afterwards if you'd like to get those results. There's some really interesting counterintuitive results that came out of this model. Another project was using remote sensing data to actually look at crop switching. From 2008 to 2021, you can from remote sensing, you can now get an up to date to say, oh, they're growing corn here, soybeans here, row vegetables here, almonds over here. And putting that together spatial temporally, here's a national map of crop switching. So on the x-axis is the amount of crop switching, on the y-axis is the intensity of crop switching. So in other words, you could switch from lettuce to kale. That's not a very big switch, but you could switch from lettuce to almonds, or you could switch from lettuce to strawberries. Those are bigger switches. And you can see that, so this green is the high intensity, high frequency switches. There's quite a bit of that in Maine. Just very quickly, this is breaking out different regions and the changes in crop groups. And lastly, on the right is a slide on the x-axis is the climatic impact of increasing drought, basically. On the y-axis, the degree to which the changes in crops that have occurred are more adaptive to those drier climates. So since that line, it's obviously very noisy, there's a lot of noise in this, a lot of crop switching not directly driven by climate, but that blue line is basically, to the extent that has a positive slope, says there's adaptive switching of crops in response to climate change. Switching to theme 3, this is our computer science theme. There's some theoretical work. Some of you may have heard of SQL. Standard query language is a way of interacting with databases. Well, that was invented before we started putting space and time into databases. SQL has been extended to handle time very well. Doesn't handle, it's in the last 10 years been extended to handle space, but it doesn't really handle space-time very well. So this is some very foundational work about actually what are the range of spatial temporal questions somebody could ask, right? You can imagine this is the range of a species today. This is a range somewhere else is the range of a species in the future. And you could imagine a spatial temporal question of are those ranges going to cross sometime in the future? That's an interesting question, but it's not something that exists in SQL today. So really just enumerating possibilities of questions is a core theory piece of work. We're also building tools for ecologists to work with. These cubes are spatial temporal data. One dimension is time and 2 dimensions are space. And it's really very hard. Lots of graduate students here spend first year of their career trying to slap together data from different sources, different map projections, different resolutions, and ecologists really don't have tools that have the temporal dimension. If you have space, they can handle time series data like the abundance of a bird species over time, but if you have space and time, don't have good tools. So we're developing a toolkit. It's known as space-time. It's available in Python, and we're currently converting it to R. And we're, the next phase is rolling it out and having training sessions. I should mention that I think it's the week of June 12th, we're going to be doing a data science training workshop. It's open to people on the UMaine campus. If anybody's interested in that, get in touch with myself or with Bailey if you know her, and we'll get back in touch with you about details of participating in that. I don't think I have time to go in detail, but we've also been putting together this visualization dashboard. So spatial temporal data, which could include climate data, something like, in this case, we've had average nighttime minimum temperature, so daily low temperature, changing over time. But these range shifts are also spatial temporal changes. So just a web-based point and click, look at what the scientific predictions actually are. Maybe type in my home address and be able to get a time series of temperature at my location, my farm over time. So this is all on the web. This is in beta. And if you're interested, I could give you a web link and you can start playing with it. Yeah, this video is on here, but I'm just going to go ahead. Okay, so theme 1 is the ecological organisms living outdoors adapting to climate change. And we have members across all 3 universities. Again, Bailey and myself are part of this. We also have a data scientist, Leo Sincere, and a data scientist and some ecologists and graduate students at UVM as well. The grant, this, like I said, this is an example of the grant that did not survive contact with the real world. So our idea was, okay, there are these tools for like these really vague-ish 100-year in the future correlative predictions about where species will be living 100 years from now. But what, that's really not very policy relevant. It's also very spatially coarse. Can we actually come up with a map at the 1 kilometer, 10 kilometer scale and make predictions 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future, not 80 or 100 years, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And when you do that, you have to bring in a lot more detail. You might think a shorter term projection is easier, but it's actually harder. You have to bring in a lot more detail about things migrating, right, to track climate, because 100 years you can say, well, if they're supposed to live there, they'll live there. But 10 years, that's not so obvious, especially with the tree. It's going to get where it wants to get in 10 years. So Now you have to bring in the land use because things are migrating through a human modified landscape. You have to get into the dispersal. So that was the big scientific contribution, was to bring in a lot of details of how to do these medium range, policy relevant range shifts. And we proposed to do all trees, all birds, just because we thought that would be of high interest, and there's lots of data to back up that, including not just to parameterize our models, test our models, validate our models. And then we were a little more vague, but we're definitely going to do some crops and some disease vectors like Lyme's tick or equine encephalitis mosquitoes. So that was the proposal. And we certainly have been working away at that. And this is an example of a single individual migrating through time through a fragmented landscape, human modified landscape, and bringing in demography, population growth, and a lot of dispersal. This has turned out to be a really interesting project in a basic science kind of way, where it turns out a lot of ecologists have really ignored the space dimension to population dynamics. So we've really been, I'd say, advancing the science on the basics of spatial temporal population dynamics. Yeah, that slide. But this is where things started to deviate. So you've seen this figure a couple times now. This is a shift in blueberry ranges. Right after our grant got awarded and there was a news release, I got a call from Eric Venturini, who's the head of the Maine Blueberry Growers Association. And we used this figure in the release, and he was very very kind but very direct. He was like, our blueberry growers are going to stay on their land. So just saying they're going to move out of there is not that helpful. It would be more helpful to have conversations about what kind of climate is going to be causing changes. How can that climate be mitigated? Is irrigation going to make a difference? Is some sort of soil amendments to maintain moisture going to help that difference? It's warming, so it's not so much the heater in, bringing heaters in, but the shade or something else going to help with it. He was really more interested in an adaptation problem and not just range shift problem. So right there, the whole grant, at least from the ecology side, was written around range shifts. And, here's one of our potential stakeholders saying, yeah, farmers don't care about that, which led to a lot of conversation about, well, what do they care about? And a lot of what they cared about was much more seasonal specific. They're observing, it's the delay of the frost in September. It's the heavy rains in April that affect pollination. It's the drought midsummer. These are the kinds of things that are affecting it. And what they really cared about was yield. So it was an interaction of phenology within your climate and yields. And of course, they understood that those within your climates were going to be changing over time. And so that was the interesting question. So that's led us to go implement crop models. Some of you may have heard of DSAT if you're in the agricultural world. It's this beast of a model. It has over 200 parameters. It's an entire master's thesis to parameterize this model for one breed of crop. I've been on committees of students doing that. And we've been working on really scaling it back down. Stephanie has been really key in this. Scaling it back down to a very simplified model that still captures some of these core details of photosynthesis, water uptake, water loss through the leaves, and these kinds of things. But that is scalable to run it, every pixel across the state of Maine and Vermont, and to run it every year from now until 2100. But incorporating these details of within your variability. What you see at the bottom. So far, all we've done is we've kind of recreated these models for soybeans, but in a way that's much more simplified and scalable. And so we're calibrating it against soybeans, and we're very quickly already started trying to adapt this model to blueberries. We're hoping to get to either apples or peaches after that. The other feedback we got, and a lot of this came from Caleb Gosen at MOFGA, who said, you know what, I know it's not exciting scientifically or a challenge scientifically. Like I said, there's already thousands of papers that do these simple range shifts, but he said, farmers really care about pests. And we know that there's going to be a whole new category of pests if you're living in a particular place in Maine, what's bugging you today is not going to be what's problematic years from now. And so just this kind of very simplistic forecasting about changing pest dynamics, it would be really interesting. So this has led to another project. Again, this was sort of the approach we had rejected initially, because scientifically there's no novelty to it. NSF would not have been interested in this at all. But stakeholders have led us in this direction. It's putting together what we call a pest atlas, which is a list. Right now it's about 5 species, but we hope it grows to 20 or 30 species that people think are, what, they're a problem in Ohio. They're going to get to Maine. They're a problem in Virginia. I want to know if they're going to get to Maine or Vermont. And so you see on the left, this is where spotted winged Drosophila I mentioned before that it attacks soft fruits. Here's where it is today. The black dots is actual observations. The color map is the intensity of the model prediction, and here's the model predicted in the future. And you can see, I mentioned spotted winged Drosophila has already reached Maine. There's a record there. There's a couple of records down east. There's a couple of records down near Portland. But climatically wise, it really is not a good fit for Maine right now today. And the good news is it's not going to be a fantastic fit to Maine in the future, but coastal Maine is actually going to see a significant increase of spotted winged Drosophila. And we're, expanding this to a number of other species. Okay, theme 4 is the other theme that completely morphed over time. So Katie at UMaine is our lead on this. She's a social psychologist. My postdoc Stephanie Miller Meredith is she's in the food and ag department at UVM, but has very extensive interactions with agricultural stakeholders, and myself are part of this theme. The proposal had 3 questions that were really science. They were science communication data science questions. How do you communicate complicated spatial temporal questions? And we kind of, because there was nowhere in an NSF proposal to sneak in stakeholder engagement, we kind of snuck it into theme 4. And we had a very formal structure, because that's how these grants get reviewed. The debt score grants are big and complicated, and we want to see really official looking structures. So we had a stakeholder council that was going to have 15 members, and they were going to be involved from start to finish with co-production and so forth. At this point in time, we're not doing any of that, actually. Some of the challenges, COVID lockdowns, that really was a major challenge to stakeholder engagement, especially because we were mostly trying to build new relationships, which kind of perpetuated this very centralized model of keeping the stakeholder council as a way of interacting through Zoom meetings. And since we did not come in with a strong list of a priori stakeholders, again, back at the NSF proposal format, in part for that, we had a couple on an external advisory board, but we didn't have a big list. And so we started literally making cold calls to find out who would be interested. And where we've evolved today, like I say, the year 3, probably more like year 1.5 or 2, given COVID, is we really realized that we had envisioned all along 2 different groups or types of stakeholders. And it's really been an important conceptual leap for us to actually break these 2 groups apart. One are experts. Some of them are from agricultural extension here at UMaine or UVM. Some of them are industry organization reps. I already mentioned the Maine Blueberry Growers Association and MOPCA, government, NGOs. Most of these individuals we're working with have advanced degrees in agriculture or ecology or something like that. We have a stakeholder in rural economics as well. And so my postdoc, Stephanie Miller, has really taken the lead on interacting with these people. We had several iterations of stakeholder council, but we reached a point where we felt like that was no longer productive. Really, one person was interested in lettuce and another person was interested in trees, birds, and so there was not a large overlap in organismal interest. Also, they had very different interests in their level of participation. So we really switched to a model of one-on-one interactions where we have, we continue to have a lot of conversations. And one of the first things we did as we switched to this model is actually, and I'll show you a slide of this in a minute, put for a model of different types of interaction between a research project and a stakeholder and ask them where on this spectrum they saw themselves fitting, and then kind of trying to respect and pigeonhole our relationship with them through that spectrum. Another interesting thing is we've gotten a lot of agricultural stakeholders expressing a lot of interest and investing a lot of time with us, which we appreciate. We really have not yet had a strong connection with conservation stakeholders. And, you know, I can speculate about why that is maybe in the questions, but, and then the other group of stakeholders is much larger community. It's potentially every farmer in the state of Maine and the state of Vermont. That's a lot of people, right? Different level of training, different level of background, different set of interests, probably much less interested in co-production, telling us how to model something, right? But nonetheless, clearly interested in some of our outputs. And we've really evolved this around Katie Curlew, you know, has a strong interest in science communication. And she's really been working with a lot of undergraduates. UMaine is primarily an undergraduate institution, and training them in the concept of science communication, and then using this communication as a place to learn and practice and grow in science communication. They have finally, January 2023 was the first time they actually held the climate change and agriculture conference. We finally got to go to that in person, had great interactions, started demoing a lot of the stuff we have, got all kinds of great feedback. We're also, another prong to this is we're developing a website. I showed that to you already. And it's been interesting, whether it's our external advisory board or our stakeholder council, half the people are like, farmers are never going to have the time to care and sit down and look at a map of mean annual temperature in 2050. And other people, including farmers themselves and people who work with farmers, are like, heck no, farmers are really going to be interested in that. And you guys should definitely keep pushing forward with this web-based browser. And I would say from the stakeholder engagement at the Climate and Ag Conference, the second group was right. There's really a lot of interest. You know, they're probably not going to do it in August. They're out in the middle of the fields with intense harvesting or whatever they may be doing, but in January and February, not every farmer is going to want to do that, but there appears to be a pretty strong subset of interest in that. And then, of course, we can communicate with this community through the experts as well, the extension groups, the industry groups, government NGO groups. So the net result, there's the graph on the right I was mentioning. It's sort of a model of different types of stakeholder engagement. Informing, right? Just it's a one-way communication, passing information on, consulting, asking some questions. A good example of that is we've been talking to both our experts and our larger farmer group. Well, what variables of climate do you actually care about? Turns out April rain is really important for blueberry growers. Not something we would necessarily know a priori, and not something the climate community is ever serving up because it seems really specific and narrow. But that consultation stage, right? They're not co-producing that information, but they're guiding us through the consultation. And then there's the participation stage, which is kind of the deep co-production, you know, all the way to, we don't want that kind of a model, we want this kind of a model, to, okay, you're modeling blueberries, we'll help you get the data on the growing degree days required for budding, right, or something like that. So fairly deep engaged co-production. We have stakeholders interested in all of these levels across almost all of our themes. Yeah, I already talked about the undergraduate group. It's turned out to be a fantastic experience. The undergrads are learning so much, and it's really made us much more effective in reaching out to a much larger group of farmers as well. So I'll wrap up. Just a couple of quick reflections on, you can call this lessons learned on stakeholder engagement, although none of these probably come as a shock. People who've done stakeholder engagement in the past probably already knew some of these things, but maybe I'll just call them touchstones or things to think about when engaging in stakeholder engagement. First off, I think there's I've been part of different kinds of stakeholder engagement. I think there's a fundamental difference between there's a law there's a regulation, there's an event that's going to happen. We're going to sell this plot of land, right? There's this event specificity driven stakeholder engagement. I think the intensity tends to be much higher in that area, and the scientific questions tend to be much narrower. And some of the previous track too, some of the ones David led with dam removal and the shellfish are both examples of that. And then there's some other projects, and David led one with SSI that brought Tim and I here. But this is really broad scientific question. Let's work with some stakeholders to narrow those questions, answer some things, and help inform some policy, right? It doesn't have a specific event, specific law, specific regulation. It's not tightly focused, right? It's, in fact, I would say it's diffusely focused. There's pros and cons of both those kinds of trade-offs. It's certainly harder to get stakeholders engaged in this more diffuse kind of engagement. On the other hand, it's an opportunity to drive a more fundamental, to change the scientific direction and conversation more fundamentally, right? Instead of answering a specific question in a specific episode, it's like, here are the questions that people, really, I think it's almost literally true. Nobody's ever looked at the spatial temporal picture of crop adaptation to climate change. People have taken a potato model and run it for temperatures in 2000 and temperatures in 2100, but looking at it, how that actually looks across the state of Maine through time, which is what a farmer is a lot more likely to care about, literally has never been done. And that's a question that comes out of stakeholder engagement. So, I think they're both interesting and both important, but I think it's an important distinction. Sort of diffuse versus tight stakeholder engagement. As I mentioned, with these diffuse ones, you don't necessarily inherit an immediate set of stakeholders. You kind of have to generate stakeholders and relationships. This may sound obvious, but who you end up with stakeholders, if you're really engaging in co-production, ends up driving what you do, right? And noticeably on Barracuda, we have not had a lot of engagement, and it's not for lack of effort, with conservation. And so it's really probably steered the whole project from the original vision, which had substantial work on conservation, birds and trees, to the agricultural side of things. We also had a vision of working on human diseases like Lyme and encephalitis, and we haven't really put a lot of effort into it, but we don't have medical stakeholders at this point in time. And at this point, it's kind of feeling like agriculture has enough questions and enough challenges that's going to occupy all our time. But it's an obvious point, but it's also a really non-trivial fundamental point, which is the stakeholders you have, if you're sincere about stakeholder engagement and co-production, really changes the directions of what you're doing. I've already mentioned some of the co-production that's come out of Barracuda, the crop model, which is really focusing on within your seasonal changes in climate and combined with yield. This pest atlas, which, frankly, there's not a lot of interesting science behind it, but there's a lot of stakeholder interest behind it. And because there's not a lot of interest in science behind it, it's really something very easy for us to produce. And we're already getting climate data and things together. So it's a very natural and easy thing to do that seems to be of high interest. There's some engagement with stakeholders around rural communities and economic resilience. There have been a number of grants, which kind of, if you want to think about NSF as the most removed from stakeholders, easily move closer to stakeholders as USDA funded grants that explicitly include stakeholders as part of the grants. So David already mentioned the blueberry and climate change grant, and UVM has had a couple of additional USDA grants targeting agriculture and climate change as well. A couple of other thoughts, lessons, reflection points around stakeholder engagement. Especially when you do this diffuse kind of stakeholder engagement, there's this important, I'll say tension, but it's a healthy tension, it's a productive tension between, listening with who shows up and who's interested and who's investing time in you, but also staying within your own strengths, right? We've gotten a lot of questions about, can you answer this? That's way outside of the scope, right? We assembled a team around the original grant proposal, which had a lot to do with shifting species ranges and things. And there's some adaptations like the crop model that we were able to make pretty easily. We had enough expertise, There's other questions we really have had no expertise in. So there's this interesting back and forth of bringing stakeholders on board, but making sure that they're asking questions that you're capable of answering, right? It'd be lovely to just say, ask us anything, we'll find you the answer, but that's not how universities and grant funding work. So there's this interesting, again, it's healthy and productive tension. Every study of interdisciplinarity ever has identified language or jargon as an important feature. I'd step back and say perspectives have really been a stumbling block for us. Our stakeholders are all focused around organisms. I work on row crops. I work on fruit trees. I work on blueberries. And for us, we've been really focused on models, which is how you get to predictions. And, we have these conversations and stakeholders will be like, there's no way you can do 200 species of birds. And we're like, it's one model. All we have to do is get the parameters 200 times. Right. So there's been this interesting back and forth. And I think over time, we've understood this economy and communicated better across that gap. But kind of the modeling approach versus the organism approach. And this is obvious, but stakeholders are pretty heterogeneous. One of the reasons we dropped the stakeholder council is we didn't feel like it was respectful of the time of any one stakeholder council member, because they'd get 15 minutes of what they were interested in and had to sit through 2 hours of what they weren't interested in, because somebody wanted to talk about lettuce and somebody else wanted to talk about tree fruit, right? And so that kind of goes back to the organism perspective, which I think we were a little naive and blind to when we started. And, the other point that I've already kind of made is there's so many different ways to engage with stakeholders, right? The inform, the consult, the co-production, and really respecting the different stakeholders are in different places. Some of them just really want to dive into the models with us. And some of them are like, glad you're doing this. You're asking the right question. Contact me in 3 years when you have the answer, right? So there's a lot of different interests out there. So I will stop there and I have to take questions.
Thank you, Brian. Can everybody hear me? Brian, can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can. Okay, let's get started on all these interesting things. So one question that was asked is, you mentioned that spatial temporal model over time hadn't been done for crops very much. Do you have any idea about why this might not have been done before?
Well, I think it was a question of priorities. So I mentioned this USDA DSAT model, but there are a couple of other international flavors. They've just added more and more detail, right? So they started with like water, and then they added nitrogen and soil, and they just got more and more complicated over time, which is a natural outcome of modeling. But they eventually reached a point where it was impossible to actually get it to run. Like I said, running it once was a master's thesis. And so they just kind of deepened in one dimension and failed to deepen in another dimension.
Right.
And so, part of it's the time, part of it's the computational tools, part of it's the particular stakeholders that push us to deepen in a different direction.
Thank you. You talked a lot about, in important ways, about stakeholder engagement being hard, especially because when this whole important project started, COVID really set in. What are your thoughts about if that hadn't happened? What do you think might have been possibilities to play with in terms of stakeholder engagement and involvement that would have taught you some interesting new things?
Well, I think probably a couple big effects. One big effect is connection with this larger group would have happened earlier. And I think we would, be in a much better and concrete position about what that group is looking for from us than we are at this point. We really, literally have kind of only been able to connect since January, right? That's 4 months ago. And I don't know, we could have done mass mailings to farmers, but that's a pretty hard way to start a relationship. So really, I don't regret the decision to wait till COVID disappeared and we were having conferences in person, but that whole particular connection has been significantly delayed. We'd be much further along. I also think, I mentioned a little bit about we've connected with some stakeholders pretty deeply already, but we haven't necessarily, for example, connected with conservationists deeply. I think that other group of experts, we probably would have had a broader group of experts. And the ones we've connected with have been fantastic, and they've to fundamentally change the direction of the project, but might have been more cool to fundamentally engage with 10 people at that level instead of 4 or 5. So I think COVID probably, presented some barriers there as well.
Very, very interesting and important. One of the points that you made during this that was really quite interesting is farmers can switch crops perhaps to adapt to climate change. That's a really interesting point, and in terms of the places working, to do that, it's intriguing. But if you spend much time with farmers, I come from a farm family in Iowa. One of the things that's interesting is they identify themselves as, oh, I'm a corn farmer. Oh, I'm a soybean person. What do you see as potential implications of that in terms of kind of what you're trying to do here in terms of working with people?
Yeah, this is a question that's fascinated me since I started thinking about climate change, right? There's, to scientists, there's an obvious adaptation, right? It's getting warmer, grow a warmer crop. But like you say, the set of barriers, there's social barriers, there's economic barriers, there's knowledge and training barriers, right? So from the point of view of an individual farmer, the barrier space is huge, right? The list of barriers is huge. And so that's where I think there's real opportunities for adaptation and for informing policy, right? Is removing the economic barriers, maybe loans. Is it a training issue? Is it a social issue of, my neighbor's already switched. Can I create the social networking that helps me learn from my neighbor? Are farmers more willing to share what they learn than fishermen are, right? Jim Wilson studies fishermen are notoriously unwilling to share what they've learned.
Yeah.
Right. And so, there's a whole, I could spend the whole rest of my career studying that one question about that direction of switching. Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Linda, on the theme two, which is about the farmer adaptation, sort of cultural adaptation to climate change. The crop switching component has become a major focus, and we're looking at some really exciting ways to answer the question that you're talking about specifically. So, because now, thanks to the integration with the biophysical side, where we can look at how the sort of suitability for different crops is changing over time, you can then sort of do this actually retrospectively using data from the USDA to see how the change in a climate in a given area has been matched or not matched. You saw a plot of this with the change in crops. And so the question then becomes, what is it that has been these limiting factors? And part of the exciting component of the data science here is that because we have these really large data sets, in fact, for this particular study, we're working with a national level data set, actually the whole USDA's county level data. And because of that, we can say, let's get some of the economic data, let's get the socioeconomic data. We're pulling in data on a handful of types of sort of social capital measures, including, for example, economic mobility, right? How does population density and sort of some of these things that get a little bit more towards the idea of like social identity or what have you, influence the way people change or don't change their crop choices. So we're really excited about that, and that analysis is coming soon.
Very interesting.
Linda, can I squeeze in one last question?
Can I do one before you squeeze in one more?
Go for it.
Okay. And this is just it's not really a question, but one of the things that's so great is the range of disciplines you have involved. And one of them is a community psychologist, Katie Corlew. And I wanted to just mention what a great choice, because when I was at a conference, some community psychologists came up to me and said, you have the best community psychologist now who's come to Maine, and that was Katie.
Sarah, you.
I can also ask this later, Brian, but I study farmer adaptation to climate change and decision making. So I was thinking about the moving from crop shifts to if you're using those crop models, and like Eric Venturini was talking to you about, farmers aren't necessarily going to always shift crops. So how much has your team been able to think about how to make that most useful to farmers? Like if they're just showing changes in yield, what do farmers do with that information? Like, are you able to get to the like you're going to need more irrigation, or you're going to need, like, is there practice implications that are potentially helpful?
Yeah, I mean,
That's
there's
where my
kind
brain
of
was going with that.
2 levels of adaptation, right? The big level is to change your crop.
Yep.
Which is easier or harder in some cases, like blueberries legitimately,
They're
right? The
not
soil they grow on. It's
Yep.
not like you're gonna grow corn there, even
Yeah.
if thematically you could grow corn there. Right, but the smaller scale adaptations are these management changes, mostly around water. Sometimes they could be around managing temperature, shading, and these kinds of things, but mostly around water. So yeah, out of the crop model, I think the big change, the big policy for farmer implementation management issue is really around irrigation, tiling, various ways of managing water stress. And what's the seasonality that's important, right? And those kinds of questions. So one of the simplifications we made is not including the fertilizer nitrogen component right now. It's something we could do in the future, but we've really honed it, especially because directly relates to climate change is the water piece and water management. Of course, there's all kinds of things farmers can do to manage water, soil amendment, to tiling, to irrigation, but really trying to get a handle on the water adaptation, climate change.
So we're a little past time, and I think to keep everybody on schedule, we'll stop here. If you have questions, come on up. We want to thank Brian again for a great presentation.